So late last week, I put up a post on the community tab on the channel here asking you guys for some questions about Star Wars Hunters, most specifically, I guess, to do with the PC playtest that went on last weekend, or I guess technically it was 2 weekends ago now, but that is exactly what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to be answering some of your questions from that community post. And so without wasting any time, let's get stuck right into it. Now, before we do start with the questions, I wanted to just mention this will be the last video on the channel for 2024. It's been a massive year. I want to thank you guys all for all the support across the channel and my other channels as well. But it's fair to say it's been a very busy year for me this year. And unlike me, I decided I'm going to take a bit of time off over Christmas to just finally relax after a very busy year. Spend a bit of time with the missus and literally just lounge around doing whatever I want. So like I said, this will be the last video. I will be back very early in January with plenty more content. But because of that, I wanted to just say, hope you guys have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year before I inevitably forget at the end of the video. So with that out of the way, let's get stuck into these questions. I think I've got about 8 questions for today's video. And the first one here comes from Alec DeLorean, who is actually a fellow Star Wars Hunters content creator. So be sure to go and check out his channel. His question here is, do you think they'll make any further changes to Sprocket's rework for the second playtest? And that is definitely a very good question. Now, I don't think they'll make changes in terms of physically changing abilities and stuff like that. I think the abilities that they've landed on for that first playtest, they will most likely stick with that if I had to guess. Obviously, I have no idea, but I think he felt, like he was in a very good spot. And so I don't think they'll, add an extra ability or change one of his abilities again. I think that's kind of where they've landed, but they very well may, nerf him or buff him depending on how they felt from the first playtest. There's also a good chance they just literally leave him as he was, but I'd imagine they may tweak a few things here and there just to sort of see how it goes, just simply because it is a playtest. So you may as well kind of change things, see if he works better with the new changes in the second playtest, or see if he was better in the first playtest. So I do think there may be some small changes just to like the damage values and the, the rate that he heals and all those little things. But when it comes to more like actual ability changes, I don't imagine they'll add or remove or change any of his abilities, just because that's obviously a lot of work. But I could be wrong on that. Maybe they'll come in with a completely different ability set and actually just kind of see which one works the best. So I'm not too sure, but like I said, if I had to guess, I'd say he will play the exact same. They may just slightly tweak some of the values to see whether he needs a buff or a nerf heading into the actual launch of the PC version and obviously the launch of Season 5. Now, the next question comes from Alexander Wilkins, and he says, when can we expect another Empire character? And that's actually a perfectly timed question, because the next hunter we're getting in Season 5 is apparently an Imperial character. We know that it is the Kubaz Damage Hunter, and as far as I'm concerned, it hasn't been officially confirmed that this is an Imperial character, but I'll try and find the screenshot of this character that we have seen so far. It looks like this hunter has an Imperial like insignia, and so I'm going to assume that they will be an Imperial character, but again, we don't actually know that, so take that with a grain of salt. But yeah, from kind of like rumors as well as just that screenshot, it's definitely looking as though the next hunter, which will be that Kubaz Damage Hunter, will be an Imperial character, which is pretty cool, and it seemed like the perfect time to ask that question. Now, the next question comes from PD the Penguin, and he says, do you like the hunters not being known characters? In my opinion, I do, because it gives the team a lot more creative freedom to do cool stuff. Just let the old stuff die, not to be resurrected to make another shitty product. And outside of the last little bit, I don't think they need to let that stuff die. If this game was exactly the same, but it had well-known characters, I don't think it would make the game worse. But I do agree. I think that it's actually really cool that these are all completely new characters. Yes, there would be some cool fan service to get, characters that we know. It'd be cool running around as Darth Vader again in another Star Wars game. It'd be cool jumping around the map as Yoda. All of that stuff would be fun. But the way that they've done it in this game, like you said, it does allow for more creative freedom because they're not tied behind what we kind of know about those characters. If they added Darth Vader into the game, which obviously canonically doesn't make sense, but let's just say they put him in the game, I feel like we already kind of know what his ability set would be. He'd have like a lightsaber throw, he'd have a force choke, he'd be able to block, and he'd have a lightsaber as a weapon. It's already very predictable, and it just means that they really have like restraints on what they can do. How it is right now though, every single hunter that they add, they can literally do whatever they want as long as it makes sense canon wise. Then there are really no restrictions on what they can do. So I personally love that. I think it does give them a lot more freedom, and on top of that too, it also just makes a lot more sense because it to me, it doesn't make sense if we have Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker and then Anakin on the same team like we had in Battlefront 2, for example. That's not something I cared about, but this is actually canon. It actually makes sense that this is, you know, a real fight in a little arena. It's almost like the gladiators back in the day, for example. It's a real thing that's happening, and although, yeah, it still doesn't make sense, they could be, you know, two Zayners in the game, and it doesn't really make sense on that side of things. I just think this is a really cool way to do it, where they're in an arena, there's a crowd, and it just feels like it makes a little bit more sense, as well as, like I said, that creative freedom to just do whatever they want, and they are killing it so far with that stuff. We've got two Jawas in a trench coat, we've got an Ewok who rides around in a mini ATST, there's a droid who thinks he's a Jedi. Like, there's just a lot of cool stuff that they've done, and I'm sure they're going to continue to do that throughout the live service. Now, the next question comes from Juan Gal, and he says, do you think Star Wars Hunters will do decent on Steam? And then he's also got a second question that says, do you think there'll be slightly more dynamic animations for PC with how the characters move compared to mobile and Switch? Now, for that first question, I'm actually going to leave that because there's another question that I'll get to later that's pretty much the same thing, so I will just kind of avoid answering that twice. But for the second question, that's actually something that I mentioned in a video that I did just before the PC playtest came out. I do think that they need to potentially sort of update or upgrade the animations of the characters for this game. I think that's one of the few areas in this game where it does feel a little bit clunky, and it does feel like it is very much a mobile game, whereas now that it's coming to PC, I do hope that the animations look a little bit crisper, mostly just to do with the movement of the characters. If you like quickly turn around, it just kind of looks odd. It doesn't look like it's flowing nicely, if that makes sense. It's all very like stagnant and like stiff, if that makes sense. So whether they do that and update them, whether it's different for PC compared to the other platforms, I'm not too sure, but I definitely hope that they do, and I'd assume that they will, just because they are constantly working on the game. So if that's something that continuously comes up, you know, with feedback from players, then I'd imagine they will get around to that. So hopefully that's the case, but yeah, we're gonna have to wait and see. Now, the next question we have is from Advanced Creature, and they say, hey Sammy, do you think they will add a field of view slider to the PC version? This is a very tough one. I would definitely hope that they will, but whether they actually do, I'm not too sure. I don't know if they're potentially worried about giving more advantages to PC players. It's not that big of an advantage, but having a field of view slider, if you crank that all the way up, you can just see a lot more than players on mobile on the Switch. And again, it's not that big of an advantage, but it's still just another advantage the PC players will have. We're gonna have a higher frame rate, the graphics are better, so it means even at distance we'll be able to slightly see a little bit better. The game will literally just load faster on our PC compared to the Switch and mobile, and that may even impact the actual like latency in game to a certain extent. Plus, it is just kind of easier to play these games with a keyboard and mouse compared to playing with a controller, even though the controller gameplay in this game is really good. So I don't know if they'll think like, okay, let's tone it down on the advantages that the PC players will have, or whether they're not going to care about that and they just want everyone to have the best experience they can. And if that is the case, I really hope that they do add a field of view slider. It's a very small thing, but at least for me, every shooter that I play, if there is a field of view slider, I turn that up to usually around 100, where it's usually like the max is maybe 120 or 110. I always like to crank it up. I like to just be able to see more on my screen. And so, yeah, I really hope that they do. There wasn't obviously anything to do with that in the playtest. That was pretty much the first setting that I looked for. But again, like I said earlier in the video, I'm sure that with enough feedback, if that's something that PC players are sort of crying out for, then I'd imagine that they will. So yeah, that's just kind of the feedback that we need to give them. If that's something you guys really want on PC, be sure to give them that feedback, because that's really the only way that they're going to implement it. Now, the second last question that I've got here is from Bloxs, and he says, do you think the game would ever get a more competitive scene, or is the game too simple and casual for that sort of stuff? This is a pretty tough question, actually, because on the one hand, what you said at the end there, that sounds right. It is a very casual game. This game is probably made with children in mind. It's a sort of like a goofy, casual, fun game. And so at face value, it kind of makes sense that, you know, they're probably not going to have a competitive scene and stuff like that. On the flip side, they already have ranked in the game, which is in itself is competitive. I know it's not the sort of competitive scene you're talking about, but there are a lot of games out there that I've played that were probably even more competitive than this game, and they didn't have ranked modes. I'm looking at games like Battlefront, even like a Battlefield, which I know it's a very different game, but even games like that don't always have ranked. And even a lot of Call of Duty games, which have genuine esports, a lot of those games in the past didn't even have ranked either. So it's hard to say. I think it really just depends on how successful the game becomes. If it dies off after PC after the launch on PC, then it's obviously not going to get a competitive launch. On the flip side, if it ends up blowing up and doing similar to what Marvel Rivals has done, where there are like hundreds of thousands of concurrent players and it's doing really, really well, then I also see no reason that they couldn't do that, because it's already kind of set up in that way with the ranked mode in the game. There are definitely a few little tweaks that they need to make that a bit more balanced and a bit more suited for an actual competitive scene, but the, I guess, infrastructure is already there, and the game is inherently a pretty competitive game. It's a 4v4 arena shooter with objectives, and it's, people compare it to games like Overwatch and now to games like Marvel Rivals, and both of those games have a competitive scene. So I see no reason why it can't, but whether I think it will, I'm going to have to assume that it probably won't ever get a competitive scene. Doesn't really seem like that type of game, but I kind of hope I'm wrong. I think it would be pretty cool to see, to be honest. And it really will just come down to how successful, or I guess unsuccessful, the game ends up being. Now, the very last question that we have for this video is a bit of a tough one, and it comes from Larry Luthen, and he says, are you concerned about the low player count during the PC playtest? Now, I don't want to sound too negative with this. I'm going to kind of leave it short, and at the end of the day, I'm going to wait and see what the player count is like when it actually launches. But to be completely honest with you guys, I am very concerned about the player count during that PC playtest. For those of you guys who don't check up on that sort of stuff, the numbers might not all make that much sense to you guys, and they may also not be something that you care about. But for me, that's something that I do pay a bit of attention to. Again, bringing it back to Marvel Rivals, it's just an easy game to compare Star Wars Hunters to. It's another hero shooter that uses a big IP to sort of take it from just a regular generic shooter to, I guess, a generic shooter with, famous characters in a famous setting and stuff like that. So Marvel Rivals, that game has had a peak concurrent player base on Steam of around 480,000 players, as far as I'm aware. And pretty much since launch, I think the lowest it has gone is like roughly 200,000 concurrent players. And it's averaging around 350 to like 400,000 every single day. So those are really, really good numbers. As far as I'm aware, it is pretty much in the top 5 to 10 most played games on Steam at all times, which is really, really good. And the number that I just said there, 480,000 concurrent players, that's a pretty big number. I think that is in the top 25 highest peaks on Steam of all time. And when we compare that to the peak that the PC playtest had for Star Wars Hunters, well, Hunters had a peak of 338 players, not 338,000, 338 players, which is like, again, I don't want to sound too miserable or too negative here. I'm just being realistic. 338 peak concurrent players is astronomically terrible. That is like really, really not good for this game. And the thing that I want to make very clear here is that that was a playtest, so we can't judge that as the actual numbers just yet. I do think it is a pretty good idea of what this game is going to be like when it launches on Steam. I don't think it's going to do crazy numbers, but it's a playtest, so I'll be the first to say I will judge it when it actually launches. But if that is anything to go by, then unless they market the hell out of this in January next year, it's not looking good. I'm not going to lie. And if it doesn't do well on Steam, I don't want to turn this into the sky is falling, like a lot of people have sort of left comments on my concerns video that I did a few weeks back. But I'll be honest, if the game doesn't do well on Steam in the first 6 or so months, it's not looking good for this game, guys. So I am a little bit concerned about that. Now, I will be here making content, trying to do what I can to, I guess, boost the game up and get people interested. So I'm not like trying to shit on the game and say, oh, this game sucks, let's move over to something else. I want this game to succeed as much as anyone, and I'll be here trying to do my part. But just because I want it to succeed, that doesn't mean I'm delusional. The numbers were not good. In fact, the numbers were genuinely very, 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 very not good during that playtest. So it is definitely a little bit concerning. Again, I don't want to go into it too much, so I'm going to leave it there. I will touch on this once the game actually launches on Steam at the end of January, and I hope I'm wrong. I hope this game has 100,000 concurrent players on the opening weekend, and everyone can tell me to shut the fuck up. I will gladly shut the fuck up if that happens. I'll be the first one to praise the game for that, but until we get anything that indicates that's going to happen, I am just being realistic, and it didn't look great during that first playtest, which, yeah, is maybe not the best sign moving forward. But hopefully Zynga does something about that. At this point, it's not up to Boss Alien. The game that they are making and have made is really good. I actually think this game is a genuine, 7.5, 8 out of 10 in its current state, and it will only get better. But it's down to Zynga to actually market it. It doesn't matter how good the game is. If no one knows it exists, it's not going to do well. And if it doesn't do well, they'll cancel it, and no one will ever know it existed. So hopefully they change their ways a little bit. It's going to be a big few months for Hunters in the beginning of 2025, and like I said, hopefully I have to eat my words in a few months and it's got hundreds of thousands of players. There would be no one on this earth happier with that than me, because you guys know that I absolutely love this game. So that is it for the Q&A. Like I said, that will be the final video for 2024. Wanted to give you guys a big thank you for all the support throughout 2024. It's been a massive year on the channel, and like I said, hopefully you guys have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I'll be back right towards the beginning of January with plenty of Star Wars Hunters content. Obviously, we've got the second playtest in the middle of Jan, and then the actual launch, or I guess the early access launch of the game on Steam at the end of January too. So it's a big month ahead. Thank you guys for all of your questions. Hopefully you enjoyed. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and may the Force be with you always.